This is the podcast for Multifaith Matters, and I am the host, John Moorhead. And today I am privileged to have Suhag Shukla on the program. And yes, that pronunciation is correct. I double checked before the program. I'm going to read a little bit of her bio, and she can add something if she would like to help us know who she is. She is the executive director and co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. She holds a BA in religion and a JD from the University of Florida. Ms. Shukla has helped steer the foundation to being recognized as a leading voice for civil rights, human rights, and religious freedom. She's been instrumental in the development of a broad range of educational materials and position papers and blogs for a variety of platforms. Shukla was named one of 12 faith leaders to watch in 2017 by the Center for American Progress. And of course, she's got much, much more to a bio than that. Shukla, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, John, for having me. I appreciate having this conversation. I'm very much a proponent of dialogue, and that's what we're going to do.
I appreciate your willingness to come on and talk about these things. Did you have anything you wanted to add to the bio that folks should know about you?
Just maybe a little bit about where I grew up. And so I was born and raised in California. So I am I guess, Hindu American Californian.
Where about it in California? I'm from Northern California originally.
So from the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, I'm from Sacramento.
Okay, not too far.
Yeah.
And, grew up in an extended family. My grandmother lived with us, so she was a real deep influence in my life in terms of my understanding of the tradition. I was also a rebellious teenager, so I went through kind of a phase of asking why we did things. And so I oftentimes describe my identity as not being Hindu because I have to be, but being Hindu because I want to be, because I found the philosophy underlying all of the rituals and traditions that I was accustomed to seeing growing up really resonate with how I see the world and my place in it.
Fantastic. I appreciate that additional personal background. It's also always helpful not just to see people as representatives, but to find real human beings to talk to. So thank you for that. The background for our conversation today, as a Christian, I try to help my audience, other Christians primarily, have a sympathetic and informed understanding of people and other religious traditions. And they have their issues of concern and conflicts, just like all other communities do. And one of the things that caught my attention was the ongoing discussion and conflict over Hindutva. And we're going to talk about, in our conversation today, a response piece that you wrote to an online event where there's some concern. Were they addressing Hindutva, or is this really Hinduphobia? But before we get to that specific, can you help outsiders who may not be familiar with this, what Hindutva is and that kind of thing, just kind of a description by way of background?
Yeah, that's probably a $1 million question right there, because, it has many different meanings that range from philosophical to political. And so starting with maybe even just etymological, Hindutva at its root means the essence of Hinduness, or the essence of being Hindu. So for many people, when they use that word or engage with it, that's the kind of perspective they're coming from. The Indian Supreme Court has ruled on cases dealing with the meaning of Hindutva, and the Indian Supreme Court has described it as the Hindu way of life. So that kind of gives you an idea of kind of the philosophical / maybe social and legal definition of Hindutva. And then it ranges all the way to kind of what we saw in the conference. And that was there is a political, even within the political meanings of the word, you have those that view Hindutva as kind of acknowledging kind of the shared heritage and culture of the geography of India and the religious traditions that emerged from it, and that being kind of a shared heritage across all religions, including Christians and Muslims and Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, Sikhs, to kind of the more malignant definition, political definition that the conference organizers espouse, which is seeing Hindutva as kind of Hindu supremacy or Hindu fascism. So there's a broad range, and therein kind of lies some of the challenges that the Hindu community had and some of the problems the Hindu community had with this event.
So in listen to that last part of what you said there, America has struggled with Christian nationalism, this fusion of religious and political identities, and this authoritarian kind of a desire and approach in American government. Would you say that for some who are concerned about certain forms of Hindutva or certain definitions of it, that it's when it combines with nationalism, that's where the concerns might be?
I think that, yeah, that's probably a fair assessment of where that critique is coming from. I think the challenge lies in not acknowledging that there's this particular word that, especially when you're talking about something in a global context, the kind of assumption is then that this is something that goes beyond India's borders to the world. And when you have a term that also then has Hindu in it, it's inescapable of associating it with the global Hindu diaspora. And, so in the United States, for instance, Indian people of Indian origin, the vast majority of whom are Hindu, make up less than 1.3% of the entire population. So we're talking about a subset of 1.3%. So yes, there are those concerns, but they are rooted in what's happening in India and politics there. But as we saw, and we'll talk about this more later, but what we saw at the event was not necessarily a critique of specific policies or specific problems that they had, but maybe there was some of that. But there was largely a blurring of lines between Hindutva, including the way that that the organizers were trying to make the distinction between Hindutva and Hinduism. But then by the end of the program, basically you had scholars and activists saying, well, Hindutva and Hinduism is one and the same, which begs the question, well, how are we having a conference that's supposedly academic that's calling for the dismantling of Hinduism?
The way I found out about, I heard a little bit about the conference, but then Fred Stella, whom we both know, who's been on this program before, he posted a link to an article that you wrote, let's see, at americankahani.com. And that's when I asked him if he thought you might be interested in coming on and discussing it. And so that was my first exposure to the concerns about it. Can you help? I'll post a link to that article in the program notes so that folks can read your full essay on that. Can you tell us a little bit about the conference itself? Who put it together? What was it ostensibly about? And what kinds of concerns were raised by you
absolutely.
in response?
Yeah. So several weeks ago, it seems like eons ago, an announcement hit it on social media that activists and scholar activists, self-defined scholar activists, were putting together this conference called Dismantling Global Hindutva. It was going to be a virtual event that was going to bring together activists, scholar activists, as well as journalists to talk about the topic, which was dismantling global Hindutva. The website made very clear that this event was political in nature, as well as its intention. The intention was to dismantle the word, as well as the Indian political party that espouses it, which is the democratically elected party in India, the Bharatiya Janata Party. I think what really caught our attention and, huge swaths of the Hindu American community in a way that I've not seen before. And I've been in this space of Hindu American advocacy now for 18 years, and I've never seen something kind of jar the community in the way that it did. And I'm talking about thousands of people engaging in various forms of advocacy, from writing letters to calling alumni relations to signing petitions to going to social media or writing their own blogs. I think the one kind of point that really just stirred everyone was this display on the website of this event. Now, I just want to give a little bit of background on the event organizers. It wasn't any particular institution that we know of that was the main host of this event. It was just this kind of anonymous handle. There were no names of university professors originally associated with it. I did get access to some leaked emails, so I have some ideas as to some of the scholar activists that were driving it, but there was no legal entity per se that was the main host. But what we did have was a display of over 40 universities and colleges, largely based in the United States, but a few from Canada, that were listed as contributors or sponsors. So one thing is, for the Hindu American community, first of all, just from a philosophical and religious vantage, we're a wisdom tradition. Knowledge is seen as a means to realizing the truth. So when you have universities, which are supposed to be kind of institutions of education, actively or implicitly participating in something that is a partisan political event that we were certain was going to also veer into Hinduphobia, that in and of itself, just from a philosophical point, it was problematic. And I think one of the reasons why the community was so activated on this. The second thing is that the Hindu American community has largely seen its success and its ability to integrate in the United States as a result of education. When my father came here to pursue his master's studies, same thing with my mother. And that's the story of so many Hindu American immigrants who came from India or came from other parts of the diaspora. So I think the critical role of education in both our tradition as well as our story as Americans really made this issue hit home. And then, of course, there's the fact that either we were students, or we have children who are students on college campuses, or we have children who will eventually be students on college campuses, that really got people concerned that all of these prestigious universities, we're talking Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Chicago, Princeton, I mean, you name it, of the who's who of every college institution in the United States, their logos were being used to kind of imply some sort of institutional endorsement of this partisan event. The event had a few advertised speakers. Some of them were politicians from like India's Communist Party. Some were activists who have a long track record of kind of promoting Hinduphobic speech and hate speech towards Hindus. Now, of course, hate speech is free speech, but it doesn't make it right speech. So all of these things together really got the community activated and deeply concerned.
Did you have a chance? Did you try and watch any of it, or was it just concerns that were you were satisfied that you had kind of a basic understanding based upon the speakers and some of that?
No, I really am committed to understanding. It's something that we at the Hindu American Foundation promote in terms of mutual respect and understanding. And so those are values that I also espouse in my advocacy. So I absolutely watched it. Just want to make one point
Sure.
in terms of the community reaction, and then I'll talk
Yeah.
about what I saw. But in terms of the community response, as I said before, the response was unprecedented. just in the first 24 hours of our letter writing campaign. And I know that other organizations in the community were also running their campaigns in parallel. Our system was overwhelmed with close to 1 million email messages being sent to the 40 universities. And we were writing letters to the presidents, provosts, diversity and inclusion staff, as well as what's it called, public relations staff, to make our concerns known. And that was one, whether the universities had approved of their logos being used for an event that was political and partisan in nature. Most universities are tax exempt, and so they really should not be participating in a partisan event based on 501c3 prohibitions. But also, we were asking what sort of support they would extend to Hindu students and faculty on campus who may feel or fear hostility as a result of some of the speakers that were going to be invited, or were invited rather, to this event, and knowing their track records. What were they going to do to ensure the psychological safety of Hindu students and faculty? And at no point did we ask for cancellation. As I said before, I think that the solution to hate speech is more speech and more constructive dialogue. And I also believe fundamentally that the purpose of a liberal education is promoting open inquiry, supporting viewpoint diversity, and also modeling constructive engagement with different perspectives. And this event was not going to do that. And that's why it was not an academic event. They weren't inviting people that would maybe provide a diversity of perspectives on the political ongoings and policies that are being implemented on the ground in India. So just exactly what we had warned the universities ahead of time, it was probably far worse after watching the event in terms of the kinds of hateful statements that were being promoted, not just by activists, but also by activist scholars who are, on college campuses teaching any American student in their class ostensibly about Hinduism. Now, you're engaged in dialogue, I'm engaged in dialogue, and that's one of the critical ways in which we can learn about one another. But when we promote stereotypes about religious traditions or inaccuracies, we're only shortchanging the next generation of policymakers, of diplomats, of citizens who are going to be living side by side with people of diverse faiths. So I'll just give you a sampling of some of the things that were kind of said there. So one scholar said that, Hindu places of worship are quote unquote centers of material wealth and power. Now that's not untrue. Churches could be described that way as well. But then she goes further on to say, and they are not, quote, a sacred abode, a place where worshipers are made equal under God, or an organic Hindu cosmos. So that gives you an idea of some of the dismissiveness and inaccuracies that are passed off as scholarship in South Asian studies and Hindu studies. Another scholar also asked, well, after some panelists had spoken, so our panelists saying that the caste system is inseparable from Hinduism. If that's the case, why not dismantle Hinduism and not just Hindutva? And then the speakers gave their reasons as to why, yes, you're right, Hinduism is what should be dismantled. And, talking about the caste system, that's a frequent stereotype. It's taking something that's a social dynamic and equating it with the fullest philosophy and the religion. Here's two more quotes that I'll give you. This was, I believe, from an activist, that harboring the idea that Hinduism is harmless and Hindutva is the culprit will not do anything to further democratic ideals. And then the last one, I emphasize without hesitation that Hindutva is inseparable without Hinduism, and the arguments that Hindutva is not Hinduism are deeply dangerous and will not lead us to the future we want. So, these are the types of statements where Hindus and the tradition was, delegitimized and demonized. And by extension, Hindus are dehumanized. And that's really a problem, just on principle, but also from a reputational perspective for these universities who, fine, after the campaign and millions of messages going out, the event organizers were forced to take the logos down. But what they did instead was replace the logos with a list of departments from universities that were supposedly sponsoring or contributing to the event. So I still think that there's the problem here of being associated now, these institutions through their departments, with something that was overtly promoting Hinduphobia and anti-Hindu hate.
One of the things that was curious to me when I looked at the event was the dates in which it was scheduled. It took place over 9/11, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So there was a kind of a special emphasis nationally, maybe even more so than our annual usual processing of that event. And during that time, there's a lot of reflection. People are still processing grief. At the same time, we've got problems in Afghanistan with the withdrawal, renewed questions about Islamophobia that Americans are probably far more familiar with than the probability of Hinduphobia. So all this is going on. So the question I had is, why schedule it over that particular time? Any thoughts or reflections on that?
I mean, other than tone deafness, I mean, if I can't be in their mind,
Right.
but there were enough people out there who did see malintent in this as a means of um, deflecting attention, especially because the event organizers were very emphatic in their use of the word global to suggest that whatever they view as this Hindu threat to democracy, Hindu threat to peace and stability is something that's global in nature. When in fact, we saw in Afghanistan that issue is something that is indeed global, in that you have neighboring countries like Pakistan that either harbor terrorists or support terrorists who are now undermining American interests, and they're destabilizing the region, which impacts Indian interests, Bangladeshi interests, and then China's an entire different factor. So if we're talking about global, to me, global means that it transcends one nation's borders. And what we're seeing today in Afghanistan certainly does. And even 9/11 was indeed a global event, where you had people from other countries coming in and attacking Americans on American soil. And there were many people who were not Americans who died as a result of that.
Um, as I said earlier, I think many in my listening and viewing audience are probably far more familiar with Islamophobia than Hinduphobia. Can you help put this in context? What kinds of prejudices, maybe even violence, do Hindus face in America?
So there's a broad range. We've seen just actually recently, they range from kind of more kind of verbal attacks to desecration and violence. So, there was just recently in Atlanta, for instance, there's a temple that's being built, and some of the neighbors don't want that temple to be there. And so there were signs posted with a dot, which you can see behind me. I have this artwork that also has different examples of some of the head markings that Hindus might wear as a means of their religious practice. And so this sign had something about, dots not welcome or something along that lines. And we're still trying to get facts from the ground on exactly what happened. I heard that there might have been a fire at a local temple, but I'm still waiting for confirmation on that. So there's that. There's the slurs that many of us grew up with, hearing, in terms of dot heads, or being damned to hell, or go back to your country. So that kind of gives you an idea of some of the more verbal forms of Hinduphobia that we see. Then it escalates to attacks on temples. Like I mentioned, the verbal was associated with a possible physical attack. Temples in Washington, in Georgia, and other states have been desecrated, where people enter in and demolish some of our murtis, or our deities that are part of Hindu worship, or will desecrate the temple. People have been attacked. Back in the early 80s, New Jersey had a gang called the Dot Busters, and they were specifically targeting people of South Asian heritage. Many were Hindu, and they called themselves the Dot Busters. So it was a very specific targeting of Hindus, but there were victims across various religious backgrounds. And then probably the most extreme form of Hinduphobia would be ethnic cleansings and genocide. And we've seen that not in the United States, but in places like Bangladesh, in places like Pakistan, where Hindus and also Christians are facing mass and gross human rights atrocities. And we're seeing a disappearing of those populations. Afghanistan is another example where, in the early 70s, there were almost something like 200,000 Hindus, and Hindus and Sikhs, for instance, have been in Afghanistan for thousands of years. And now that's down to less than 1,000. So that's something that the Hindu American Foundation is working on. Even a place within India, like Jammu and Kashmir. Kashmir is home to Hindus. Kashmiri Pundits is what they're called. And this is their ancestral homeland. And in the 1980s, as a result of a cross-border terror proxy war by Pakistan, nearly 350,000 to 400,000 Hindus were cleansed from Kashmir. Bhutan, another example, where under a one nation, one culture policy that wanted to kind of implement or privilege Buddhism, and the particular form of Buddhism that was being practiced in Bhutan as kind of a privileged religion, that ended up to the cleansing of nearly 200,000 Bhutanese of Nepali origin, the vast majority of whom were Hindus. So that gives you hopefully a wide and broad spectrum of how Hinduphobia can manifest.
Well, unfortunately, it sounds like we still have a long way to go. Like I said, folks are, usually, I think Americans more are starting to grapple with Islamophobia, but things like, Hinduphobia has to be on the radar before folks can address it. And I've seen your community, the Sikh community, also wrestle with these kinds of things. So we've got a long way to go. So hopefully conversations like this can contribute towards a more positive outcome where these kinds of things happen less, and hopefully in the future don't happen at all. I like to try and not only provide critique in my podcast, but try and provide a positive feedback and alternative. There was this conference that had problematic elements and all of this that you've already addressed. How might a university or group of academics do something more positive that provides good information, facilitates understanding, allows for diverse viewpoints, and yet also at the same time leaves room for disagreement? What kinds of things can be done?
I think that's a great question. One, I think this is not just an issue that's afflicting South Asian studies. I think universities as a whole are really grappling with their role, their very important role in civil society. And that is to nurture and grow our next generation of citizens. And if a university does not promote open inquiry, it doesn't support a diversity of perspectives, and if it does not provide, and it does not insist that scholars as educators model how to deal with diverse perspectives, including those that they vehemently disagree with. I think we're shortchanging not just the next generation, but all of our well-being if democracy is something that we're committed to, because a democracy is as healthy as its citizens. And the universities have a very important role to play in that. I also think that politicization on university campuses, and in the media, really impact the public trust that these institutions depend on. And we've seen that in the larger scale in kind of the polarization that we're seeing, and then universities and media, and even policymakers to some extent, where they should maintain a certain level of objectivity and neutrality, they're not doing that. And so I think that there are many opportunities. There are many scholars on campuses who are committed to that, but are oftentimes silenced as a result of scholar activists who then begin using the type of language and rhetoric that really saying it's academic freedom, but really actually undermines academic freedom, because you are using, ad hominems as opposed to kind of discussing content and critiquing content. Critiquing to me is an academic exercise. Dismantling is not. Deconstructing also is an academic exercise. So that's certainly there. If universities can provide opportunities for people of different viewpoints to come together and dialogue, I think that is another important step. And also for universities to be more aware of the different ways in which Hinduphobia or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or anti-Christian sentiment, how they can take form, and providing space and support for students, emphasizing again these kind of core values. We're not talking about canceling people or speakers, but if a speaker comes on campus or there's a professor who engages in hateful rhetoric, how can a student or other faculty members get support from the university to stand up against it? And I think those are all ways in which the university, as well as students and parents, can demand a better model for the future.
I appreciate those positive suggestions. I've come to the end of my questions. Is there anything I've missed that you would like to share with the audience about this?
I think I probably missed making a point about Hinduphobia in terms of just narratives. And that is kind of the broader understanding of Hinduism, is still largely framed from a Western worldview. And so there's more of a stereotyped or inaccurate understanding of Hinduism, or an understanding that comes from a vantage that doesn't necessarily seek to understand how Hinduism lives as a tradition in the everyday lives of Hindus. And so I just want to make that point in terms of how Hinduphobia can also manifest in media narratives, or even in the academic study of religion. And that too is also a broader issue. That religion, the academic study of religion, very often comes from if it were agnostic, I think I would be okay, but it almost comes from a hostile perspective in the way that religion is treated, unlike other subjects. So, to the extent that you can get more people of faith involved in the academic study of religion, this idea that you cannot be objective simply because you are an adherent to a faith, I don't buy into that. Everyone has their biases, whether it's science or math or anything else. So I don't hold religious studies to be any different. So I think that there's opportunity there for more Hindu Americans to pursue, in addition to just their own religious practice and study, but to actually pursue the academic study of Hinduism.
I appreciate that reminder of our lack of objectivity. I think particularly academics, we try to be as objective as possible, but we have
Mhm.
to account for our subjectivities, our location, our biases, and if we can properly account for them, then we're in good shape. But a lot of
Right.
times, we don't. So, well, I just want to thank you for somebody who you didn't know reaches out and says, "Hey, come on my program where evangelicals are there." Then and you didn't hesitate, and I appreciate you coming on and shedding some light and helping my audience understand these issues.
Thank you. I'm really glad we had this conversation and look forward to having more.
Great. Me too. My guest today, again, has been Suhag Shukla, and she's with the Hindu American Foundation. Check the program notes for a link to her article and a link to her website and where you can find more about the work that she is doing. I want to thank my guest and my listeners and viewers. Until the next edition of the Multi-Faith Matters podcast.